Hello, all. This is Dr. Robert Ryan. I am working on information support for those of you who are tracking the COVID-19 scenario with great detail. Um, those of us who have been active in this crisis in terms of doing internet research have been very frustrated with the mainstream media um, and the social awareness level of what's really going on. And I felt compelled to get involved, especially since I'm one of the victims of the crisis. I was on the job market and was looking at a couple of different tenure track positions as a business professor, and those were taken from me by the shutdown. And these are positions that basically I'm not going to be able to just hop right back into. These are positions that only come up once a year. And so an entire year of my life was given up to this, not a month. It's not a normal job market. It's not like where you just constantly put out applications every month. This is a yearly cycle. So I lost an entire year of my employment life to this crisis. Um, and so after that happened, I said, well, what I can do right away is try to help by getting involved in the sense making of what's going on. And since I've done that, I've been alarmed at just how huge the knowledge gap is out there. There's a very large knowledge gap between the frontier of science and innovation and the public's general knowledge of the virus and so forth. And a lot of that knowledge gap is because of the mainstream media. In other words, there is some active attempt on the part of the mainstream media to try to ensure that knowledge gap, to try to make sure that you don't know what you want to know. And this shouldn't be too surprising because the powers that be have never trusted the public with full knowledge. Uh, in wartime, we have classified information for a reason. The belief is that the public couldn't handle the truth, and if the public gets their hands on partial truths, those could be even more dangerous than no truth at all. And so there's this general belief that the public cannot be trusted with the full story, and that the main function of the mainstream media is to manage the public, not inform the public. There's a very big difference between those two things. And I pointed out um, to many of my friends that we've had a really long history in this country of developing public relations positions that are intentionally obscuring of the truth. Propaganda. And the purpose of that propaganda is to try to ensure that people's perceptions of the world do not become shattered by facts. So that when new information presents itself, they don't have a crisis of meaning or a crisis of um, identity or any sort of crisis that might cause more harm than good. So you have to gently introduce people to information and so forth. Um, Now, it gets even worse than that. We also have a political situation where the left and the right are highly polarized. And for a good stretch of time, both the left and the right wing media were doing an atrocious job of informing the public. They were doing universe maintenance. Basically, what they were doing was trying to continue to prop up the perspective, the universe that that their constituents live in. So the right wing was trying to make sure that whatever it is that the right wingers believed was being supported by the facts and insulated. Um, the left wing was doing the same thing. They were trying to make sure that the left wing narrative was insulated. So we all know this. We know what a mess the mainstream media is in terms of this. Now, the alarming thing is that when you get faced with a general crisis, there's supposed to be a transcending of those political biases. And you'll hear both sides trying to tell you that they're doing just that, that they're the ones transcending the crisis, and that the other side is not, that the other side is playing politics. And that's, pretty much what always happens. Oh, well, there's an economic recession. Those people don't have your best interest at heart. We do. Um, Same thing with this crisis. So, um, Trump's only doing what he's doing to try to get reelected. It's not actually in anyone's best interest. On the other hand, the Democrats are only trying to get Trump fired. It's not in anyone's best interest. And through this situation, a lot of us are trying to figure out if there's any alternative narratives. Is there any third narrative? Or maybe even fourth or fifth? Are there any other ways that we can reconstruct what's going on with COVID-19? And the short answer is yes. And the short answer is that one of the best actors out there who's doing this is Tucker Carlson. But that's just what you would call our guy on the inside. Tucker Carlson is one of those actors who is not truly following a traditional right-wing media narrative. He's actually much more involved in the intellectual dark web narrative, which means that he's closer to the alternative media than he is to the rest of the mainstream media. And this is very interesting. Now, I could talk for hours. I mean, hours about how that works. Basically, the current media situation that we have, what's going on with the intellectual dark web, what is it that's separating them from the left and the right, and so on and so forth. But I'm going to do my best to keep this conversation focused specifically on COVID-19 and how this particular crisis is exposing a deeper crisis in society. And that deeper crisis is not merely political. The deeper crisis in society is epistemic. In other words, I'm saying that we are having an epistemic crisis in the 21st century because our ways of knowing truth are under question. And that a lot of what's going on with the left wing and the right wing is that they're defending epistemic positions, ways of knowing truth, ways of vetting facts, ways of making sense of the world that are outdated. And this is because they were treating the 21st century as if it's largely just continuous with the 20th. No major breaks, no major changes, no revolutions. The last revolution we had in culture was in the 1960s, right? Well, if that's wrong, if we actually have had major revolutions since the 1960s, but we're operating under a political and media system, and even worse, a system of science and education that has not caught up with that cultural and technological revolution, then we are basically trying to make sense of the 21st century using 20th century lenses. And so if that's the case, it becomes immediately obvious why not only is this a media crisis or a political crisis, but it's actually a scientific crisis. It is a crisis of the very way, and the education system, of the very way that we vet information. How do we determine that something is a fact? How do we validate it? How do we act on it? And to drive home this point, I'm going to argue that one of the industries that is facing that epistemic crisis full force is the medical industry. The medical industry is one of those industries that very often operates on poor information. Uh, Good enough, basically. Business in general is like that. The great Herbert Simon, who developed the theory of satisficing, won the Nobel Prize for economics. I think it was the 1960s. He got the award, but he started working on it in the 1940s. The argument is that in most human endeavors, we don't optimize anything. We do good enough, just good enough to pass our hurdles of um, our goals. Basically, so a business does just good enough work to meet its objectives, and any work above that is either too difficult or too expensive or hard to justify. Well, the medical industry does a lot of just good enough sense making so that it can act, save lives, and so forth. Well, the thing is that many of the validation processes of truth in the medical industry are under attack, uh, and COVID-19 is a wonderful case study or horrible case study, depending on how you use your words. It is a horrible case study in what happens when sense-making systems go wrong. And it's helping to expose that we are going through a revolution in culture and technology for which neither political party is prepared. The mainstream media is not prepared. And one of the only actors out there who is starting to understand this and act on it, oddly enough, is Donald Trump. And the fact that Donald Trump is smart enough to understand these things is blowing minds. There are people all over the world who have been underestimating um, Donald Trump's reasoning abilities for decades. Basically, his entire career, people have been calling him stupid, idiotic, and so forth. But what they don't really realize is that there's a very big difference between the words that come out of your mouth and the words that are in your head, and that much of Donald Trump's stupidity is an act. Um, he's mastered the fourth grading reading level of talking to the public. That's on purpose. That's not an accident. It's not because Donald Trump is a fourth grade reading level. That is because he has worked for decades, to perfect public communication. How do you talk to the ordinary working stiff, many of whom don't even have college educations? In other words, his target audience, he's trying to make sure that someone with a pedestrian 90 IQ or maybe even 85 IQ can follow his reasoning. That does not make him stupid. It makes him clever for adjusting himself to the audience he's speaking to. And anybody who knows anything about public persuasion, Scott Adams, for example, has brought this up innumerable times. And the media continues to reject that theory and basically say, no, he really is that dumb. Well, the thing is, if he's really that dumb, how come he's one of the only people in the world right now talking about revamping our national innovation system, preparing for the 21st century in such a sweeping way that it connects directly to this crisis? So far, anybody who's been talking about preparing for the 21st century has not come up with a theory of how crises such as these are related to that transition. Donald Trump has been doing that. In fact, in the past several days, he's done he's done press releases and conversations with Sean Hannity and other things that he's done with the media, where he's revealed some of his thinking on this issue. And the fact that he sees COVID-19 as being one of the best opportunities for sparking interest in this radical transition to a new national innovation system with a new kind of epistemic focus, a new way of structuring the whole darn thing, and a change of technology and culture to prepare for the 21st century and the technology revolution that we are currently undergoing. Now, does he explain this in a way that impresses smart people? No. He explains it in a way that impresses everybody uh, um, who is looking for change but doesn't understand how that works. So he's trying to explain it to the hardest audiences, not to the smartest audiences. And this is causing a lot of confusion, as it always does with Donald Trump. Everybody just says, well, he must be stupid. Really, again, that's not a fair evaluation. The way that you evaluate so this is part of the problem, is that most people have a poor way of knowing facts. Their epistemic biases show. The very way that somebody evaluates the intelligence of Donald Trump reveals their epistemic biases. The very way that someone evaluates the intelligence of the proposals that he's suggesting for COVID-19 reveals your epistemic biases. It reveals your biases about how knowledge works itself and how you identify competence. How do you identify somebody having your best interest at heart? How do you identify a good actor versus a bad actor? How do you identify actionable information and innovations that are actually going to lead you forward, as opposed to vaporware and fairy dust proposals? And the thing is that those people who have a really bad needle or gauge for measuring the truthiness of knowledge are floundering because their whole way of knowing is wrong. They never learned how to learn. They never learned how to critically evaluate knowledge itself. They've only learned how to proceduralize knowledge. In other words, they can follow a rule, but they haven't learned that knowledge is not rule-based. That information can be proceduralized, but that deeper knowledge cannot. I'm going to do a little bit of a break here before I go into the next video. But this is basically a preamble, and the whole point of this video is to establish where we are now. We're in a knowledge crisis, and COVID-19 is simply a revelation of that knowledge crisis. That's the real function that it's performing for society. It's revealing what it is we are getting wrong about how we approach understanding. And there's so much to say. I could do hours and hours of this, but I'm going to do my best to cut to the most direct narrative that I can. And what I'm going to do is try to cut to what it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about COVID-19 directly. I'm going to talk about its origins. I'm going to talk about what we already knew about it before it got out in the press. You know, what did the scientific community already know? What is it that everything we got wrong from the beginning? Who was making the wrong calls? Then I'm going to get into how does the virus actually work and why there's so much bad information on major news networks about it. That's alarming, but true that we know a hell of a lot about how the virus works, but because of our ways of knowing, we don't consider that true knowledge yet. Even though we have some pretty incredible ways of knowing that have already done some pretty incredible vetting of that knowledge, it still doesn't count as truthy to those people who believe in authoritarian systems of public policy and mass media persuasion and mass control. Because those ways of knowing, even though they work for science and they work for innovation and they work for business, are not going to work for managing the public perception, because it would shatter the popular theories of knowledge. It would shatter how the left wing approaches knowledge. It would even shatter how the right wing approaches knowledge. And we can't have that. Nobody wants to see a total crisis, a total universe collapse. People are too afraid that their knowledge universes are going to collapse. So we have to perform universe maintenance. We have to try to make sure we slowly ease people into, say, a depoliticized view. But it's going to be really painful, because in the process, people are going to have to realize that they have largely misunderstood science and innovation their entire lives, and the economy, and how the public media works, and that even the conspiracy theories around these things have been more wrong than right. So you can't turn to the conspiracy theory media to get your answers either. The only way you can actually get the true answers is with true education. And many of the people who are most capable of solving these problems are people with very abstract educations in things like philosophy of science. Those are the kinds of people who understand the knowledge crisis and are working to try to come up with better solutions and explanations of knowledge. And so, without much further ado, I'm going to wrap up this video, and we're going to get into COVID-19, and then I'm going to go from there into an explanation of where we need to go in the future to fix the knowledge crisis, and also why this person right here, who has never been affiliated with either major political party, is calling it right now that Donald Trump is most likely going to be reelected, and that is most likely in our best interests. And again, I'm not saying that as somebody who has ever voted for a Republican. And I'm saying that as someone who usually votes third party if any option is presented. Like, I used to vote for people like Ralph Nader and Ross Perot. Those are the kinds of candidates I've supported as change candidates. So I'm not saying Trump's my ideal candidate, but what I'm saying is he's better than what anything the left has been presenting, other than Yang and Gabbard. That basically Yang and Gabbard were the best hope for the Democratic Party for the short term, and they are still probably the best hope for 2024 and 2028. But short of, especially Yang, especially short of the Yang type outcome, I'm telling you that Trump is probably our best bet right now. And that's because Trump is the only candidate at this point, I mean, it's him versus Biden, who's trying to put together a new way of knowing. And not a new way of propaganda so much. He's done that. I'm not going to argue against it. He also plays propaganda games. But more to the point, underneath that propaganda, he's working on real policy to change the way our entire society works in terms of knowledge management. The infrastructure of education, science, knowledge, industry, and those changes are positive. They're not dystopian. They're not utopian either, but they're definitely not bad. Okay, so let me wrap this up, and then I'm going to go ahead and start the COVID-19 video.